The fate of Western Europe did not hinge in Rome. It did not hinge in Constantinople. It hinged on an open field in Gaul, where the last strength of a dying empire stood between civilization and the most feared warlord of late antiquity. June 451 AD. On the rolling expanse of the Catalaunian Plains, near modern Chalons en Champagne, two worlds prepare to collide. On one ridge stands Flavius Aetius, Rome's final great field commander, a strategist shaped by decades of frontier warfare, once a hostage among the Huns, now the only man capable of uniting Rome's former enemies into a single desperate coalition. His army is not purely Roman. Those days are gone. Instead, it is an alliance forged by necessity. Roman regulars, Visigoths under King Theodoric I, Alans, Franks, Burgundians, perhaps 50,000 to 60,000 men, though the numbers remain fiercely debated by modern historians. They lock shields on elevated ground, the key terrain that will decide the battle. Across the plain waits Attila the Hun, master of the steppe confederation stretching from the Danube to the Hungarian plain, ruler of Ostrogoths, Gepids, and countless subject tribes. To Roman chroniclers, he is the flagellum Dei, the scourge of God. His host, likely comparable in size to Aetius's, perhaps 50,000 or more, is built for mobility and shock. Mounted archers who strike like storms, heavy cavalry armed with long lances, Germanic infantry contingents hardened by years of conquest. Attila has already devastated Gaul's cities. Metz burned, Rheims threatened, the countryside stripped bare. If this coalition fails, there is no second army waiting. The battle erupts in chaos. Control of the central ridge becomes the fulcrum. The fighting is savage, close, unrelenting. According to Jordanes in his Getica, our principal narrative source, though prone to exaggeration, the slaughter is immense. Modern scholars caution that casualty figures in the tens or hundreds of thousands are implausible. Yet there is no doubt, the field becomes a charnel ground. In the fury, King Theodoric I is thrown from his horse and killed, either trampled or struck down in the melee. His death could have shattered the coalition. Instead, it ignites it. The Visigoths, led now by Thorismund, surge forward in vengeance. Pressure mounts against Attila's center. The Hunnic advance falters. As evening descends, Attila withdraws into a fortified wagon laager, his defensive circle of carts, preparing for a last stand should the Romans press the assault. They do not. By dawn, Attila begins his retreat eastward. Was it a decisive Roman victory, or a brutal stalemate that merely halted the storm? Historians still debate it. What is certain is this: Attila's westward advance into Gaul was stopped. The Western Roman Empire, fractured and fading, had achieved one final strategic triumph. The coalition held. The Huns withdrew. Europe did not fall to a steppe empire in 450 once the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains stands as one of late antiquity's pivotal confrontations, a moment when diplomacy, terrain selection, and coalition warfare proved as critical as raw force. Now we march deeper, into the invasion that set Gaul ablaze, into Aetius's fragile alliance of former enemies. into the mechanics of one of history's most debated battles, and into the legacy of a clash that marked Rome's twilight, but also its last great stand. Hold your line. The Huns are coming. Part 1. Setup: Attila's rise and the invasion of Gaul. Steel was already ringing across Europe long before the armies met on the Catalaunian Plains. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire was no longer the colossus of Trajan or Constantine. It was a fractured organism, bled by civil wars, economic contraction, shrinking tax bases, and the permanent settlement of barbarian federates within its borders. Imperial authority in Ravenna was fragile. Real power rested not with emperors, but with generals. At the center of that power stood Flavius Aetius. Born around 390, likely of Illyrian or Scythian background, Aetius had been shaped by the frontier. As a young hostage, first among the Goths, and then among the Huns, he absorbed the methods of Rome's most dangerous enemies. He learned steppe diplomacy, cavalry tactics, and the brutal arithmetic of power politics. When he rose to the rank of Magister Militum, he became the true architect of Western survival, propping up the weak reign of Valentinian III while eliminating rivals with cold precision. Ironically, earlier in his career, Aetius had even used Hunnic mercenaries to secure dominance within the empire. Now, he would have to stop them. Attila Ascendant. Beyond the Danube, another figure was reshaping the political map of Europe. Attila rose to joint power with his brother Bleda in 434. Together, they forged a vast Hunnic confederation stretching from the Hungarian plain to the fringes of the Black Sea. After Bleda's death, likely murdered by Attila in 445, Attila ruled alone. He transformed the Huns from raiders into kingmakers. Eastern Rome paid staggering annual tribute in gold. Balkan provinces were ravaged repeatedly in the 440s. Subject peoples, Gepids, Ostrogoths, Rugians, Scyrri, Thuringians, and others, were bound into his war machine. His power was not merely military. It was political, economic, and psychological. Roman diplomats feared him. Barbarian kings obeyed him. By 451, the western provinces lay exposed. Why Gaul? Attila's invasion of Gaul in 451 remains one of late antiquity's most debated campaigns. Several motives converge. Strategic expansion into wealthy Gallic territories. A bid to undermine Aetius's growing influence. The famous episode of Honoria, sister of Valentinian III, who reportedly sent Attila her ring, possibly as a plea for rescue from an arranged marriage. Attila seized upon this as a pretext, claiming half the Western Empire as her dowry. And, as always, plunder. What is clear is the scale. Modern scholarship generally estimates Attila's coalition at perhaps 40,000 to 60,000 warriors, though ancient sources inflate the number higher. His host was multi-ethnic and formidable. Hunnic mounted archers at its core, supported by Gepids, Ostrogoths under Valamir, Rugians, Scyrri, Thuringians, Alans, Franks, Burgundians, and others. It was less a tribe than an imperial war federation. The campaign began with fire. In April 451, Metz fell and was sacked brutally. Other cities followed or opened their gates in fear. The army advanced toward Aurelianum, modern Orléans, where siege operations began. Panic rippled through Gaul. Western Rome had one field army of consequence, and it was not enough alone. A coalition of necessity. Aetius understood that Rome could no longer defeat Attila unaided. He turned to former enemies. The most crucial alliance was with the Visigoths of Aquitaine under Theodoric I. For decades, Romans and Visigoths had fought one another. Now they stood shoulder to shoulder. Additional forces joined. Franks along the Rhine frontier, Burgundians, Armorican contingents, Alans under King Sangiban. Altogether, estimates again vary, but modern historians suggest perhaps 50,000 to 70,000 men, a coalition roughly comparable in size to Attila's. Yet this was no unified national army. It was a fragile alliance of competing interests. Goths sought expansion. Alans guarded their own survival. Roman commanders balanced rival kings who mistrusted one another almost as much as they feared the Huns. If cohesion failed, Gaul would burn. The turning point. As Attila pressed toward Orléans, Aetius marched hard. Reinforcements arrived in time. The Huns lifted the siege and withdrew eastward, deliberately, strategically, seeking ground favorable for a decisive confrontation. The chosen battlefield lay on the open expanses near modern Chalons. There, cavalry could maneuver. There, alliances would be tested. There, Rome's fate would hinge not on imperial decree, but on whether enemies could fight as one. The plains were waiting, and the thunder of hooves was already rolling across Gaul. Part 2. The invasion's path, from the Rhine to the plains. The storm did not appear overnight. It rode in from the Rhine, methodical, deliberate, unstoppable. The crossing of the Rhine. In the spring of 451 AD, Attila launched his western offensive. His coalition army, Huns at its core, reinforced by Ostrogoths, Gepids and other subject peoples, crossed the Rhine frontier into Roman Gaul. The frontier defenses that had once anchored imperial security were shadows of their former strength. Belgica was first to feel the blow. On Easter, the city of Devoderum, modern Metz, was overwhelmed. Contemporary and near-contemporary accounts, especially from Jordanes, describe slaughter and devastation. While late antique sources exaggerate casualty numbers, archaeology confirms destruction layers in several Gallic urban centers consistent with mid-5th century violence. Metz burned. Its fall sent shockwaves through the region. Other cities, Reims, possibly Trier, and settlements across northeastern Gaul, either suffered assault or opened their gates in terror. The campaign was not random raiding, it was strategic terror, designed to paralyze resistance and fracture Roman authority. The Siege of Orléans. Attila's advance bent southwest toward Aurelianum, modern Orléans, an operationally vital city controlling routes along the Loire. By June 14, 451, the Hunnic coalition had invested the city. Siege operations began in earnest. Contrary to popular imagination, the Huns were not incapable of siegecraft. Through years of Balkan campaigns against the Eastern Empire, they had learned to employ captured Roman engineers and siege machinery. According to later sources, the walls were breached, or on the verge of collapse, when relief arrived. Flavius Aetius had moved swiftly. His coalition, Romans, Visigoths under Theodoric I, Alans, Franks, Burgundians, forced Attila to reassess. Rather than risk encirclement near fortified terrain, Attila made a calculated withdrawal eastward. This was not a rout. It was repositioning. Toward the open plains, Attila sought ground suited to his strengths: mobility, mounted archery, coordinated cavalry shock. The retreat led toward the broad expanses traditionally identified as the Catalaunian Plains, somewhere between modern Chalons-en-Champagne and Troyes. Precise location remains debated among historians, but the terrain was characterized by open fields broken by a central ridge or elevated feature, terrain that would become decisive. Aetius pursued. His forces harassed the withdrawing Huns with skirmishes, preventing orderly consolidation but avoiding full engagement until conditions favored the coalition. This was operational patience, forcing Attila to commit to a set-piece battle rather than a fluid war of maneuver. Ancient tradition records that before the clash, Attila consulted diviners. The omens were ambiguous. Disaster loomed, but not necessarily his own alone. Whether apocryphal or not, the story reflects the psychological tension before battle. Jordanes preserves a speech attributed to Attila, defiant, incendiary, urging his warriors to despise the weak Romans and their barbarian allies. As with most ancient battle speeches, its verbatim authenticity is doubtful. Its symbolic function is not. This was not merely a raid anymore. It was a confrontation between power blocks. Lines converge. By the time both armies deployed on the plains, the Scythes campaign had already reshaped Gaul. Cities lay charred. Refugees fled south. Roman authority hung by a thread. Now the armies formed ranks. Attila's center anchored by Hunnic cavalry. Ostrogoths and Gepids positioned on the wings. The coalition arrayed with Romans and Alans centrally, Visigoths massed on a flank, both sides eyeing the critical high ground. The march from the Rhine had been swift and devastating. The next movement would be slower, measured, and soaked in blood. The plains were ready. Tactics would decide the fate of the West. Part 3. Battle formations and tactics. The ridge and the charges. No walls, no fortresses, no second chances. On the wide sweep of the Catalaunian Plains, two composite empires formed for annihilation. This was not a clash of simple lines. It was a confrontation of military systems, Roman coalition warfare against steppe shock doctrine. The deployment Flavius Aetius understood one principle above all. Terrain decides survival. A low but critical ridge dominated the battlefield. Whoever controlled it would command visibility, defensive leverage, and momentum for downhill assault. Aetius anchored his line with deliberate calculation. Left wing. Roman regulars under his direct supervision. Disciplined infantry designed to hold formation under pressure. Center. Alans under King Sangiban, positioned deliberately. Ancient sources suggest Aetius doubted their loyalty. Placing them centrally ensured they could neither defect nor withdraw without immediate consequence. Right wing. Visigoths under Theodoric I, heavy cavalry and warbands capable of decisive offensive shock. It was a coalition deployment engineered for containment and controlled aggression. Across the field, Attila arranged his forces with equal strategic intent. Our principal narrative source, Jordanes, in the Getica, describes Attila drawing up his lines with subject peoples on the wings and his Hunnic core in the center. a formation consistent with step command hierarchy. Center, Hunnic elite cavalry, mounted archers, and heavy horse intended to deliver the decisive breakthrough. Left wing, Ostrogoths, ironically facing their Visigothic kin across the field. Right wing, Gepids and other Germanic contingents. Attila's objective was operationally clear: rupture the center before coalition cohesion could translate into coordinated counterattack. The tactical logic. Aetius fought defensively, but not passively. By securing the ridge, he forced the Huns to attack uphill. Roman infantry, though diminished compared to earlier centuries, still excelled in static resistance. Shield walls, disciplined spacing, and command control made them difficult to dislodge in prepared positions. The Visigoths were the coalition's hammer. Unlike Roman infantry, they specialized in aggressive cavalry charges, heavy riders designed to exploit weakness once the enemy stalled. Attila's method was different. Hunnic warfare emphasized disruption. Mounted archers to harass and disorder enemy formations. Rapid maneuver to stretch lines. Concentrated shock in a chosen sector, typically the center, to collapse morale and create cascading panic. If the Alans buckled, the Roman line would fragment. If the center collapsed, Visigoth cavalry superiority would become irrelevant. The battle opened with a violent contest for the ridge itself. Both sides recognized its importance. Control of that elevation would dictate the flow of the engagement. The collision. Then came the charges. Arrows darkened the air as Hunnic horse archers advanced, loosing volleys to weaken the coalition center. Drums and war cries echoed across the plain. Germanic contingents on both flanks surged forward in brutal close combat. At the heart of the field, Attila pressed hard against the Alans, seeking precisely the fracture he needed. Pressure mounted. The line bent, but did not break. On the wings, Visigoths and Ostrogoths crashed into one another in a savage kin struggle. Goth against Goth, cavalry against cavalry. The fighting devolved into close-quarters chaos. The ridge became the fulcrum. Control shifted in grinding waves of advance and counterattack. Roman infantry held firm under missile fire. Visigothic cavalry exploited openings. Attila's center surged repeatedly, testing the coalition's cohesion. Jordanes writes that the struggle was so intense that streams of blood supposedly altered the landscape. An exaggeration, certainly, but indicative of the perceived ferocity. This was not maneuver warfare anymore. It was attrition at sword's length. And as the sun lowered, the battlefield approached its most decisive and tragic moments. The fury had only begun to peak. Part 4. Key moments: the hill, Theodoric's fall, and Attila's lager. By late afternoon, the sun's battle had narrowed to a single, decisive feature of ground: the ridge. Whoever held it would dictate the final phase of the day. The struggle for the height. At some point during the engagement, forces on Attila's side, likely Gepids, managed to seize or contest the elevated ground. Control of that ridge threatened the entire coalition alignment. From that height, missiles could rake the Roman Alan center. Downhill momentum could shatter cohesion. The Visigoths answered with violence. Under Theodoric I, heavy cavalry surged uphill in a brutal countercharge. What followed was not maneuver, it was collision. Goth fought Goth. Lances splintered. Formations dissolved into close-quarter killing. During this chaos, Theodoric fell. The sources diverge. Some claim he was struck by a missile. Others say he was thrown from his horse and trampled. Our primary narrative account from Jordanes dramatizes the moment. but modern historians treat the details cautiously. What is not doubted is the consequence. The Visigothic king was dead. In most late antique armies, the loss of a monarch mid-battle triggered collapse. Instead, it triggered fury. His son, Thorismund, rallied the Visigoths and drove forward with renewed aggression. The counterattack reclaimed the contested height and began to exert pressure against Attila's formations. The ridge, once endangered, became the pivot of Hunnic vulnerability. The crisis in the center. While the wings raged, Attila launched his decisive effort where he had intended from the start, the coalition center. The Alans under Sangiban bore the brunt. They wavered under concentrated mounted assault. Hunnic cavalry, supported by subject infantry, attempted to punch through before Visigothic success on the flank could roll inward. Here, Flavius Aetius proved decisive. Roman infantry reinforced the center at critical moments, preventing rupture. Shield. Formations absorbed impact. Discipline held where panic might have spread. The coalition bent, but did not disintegrate. By late afternoon, the tactical initiative began to shift. The Lager. As dusk approached, pressure mounted against Attila's corps. The Visigothic advance from the ridge threatened envelopment. Casualties had been severe on both sides. Command cohesion frayed. Attila made a calculated withdrawal. He pulled his forces back into a fortified wagon circle, a traditional steppe defensive formation known as a lager. Carts were chained and locked together, creating an improvised fortress. Inside, the Hunnic king prepared for either a renewed assault or a last stand. Jordanes claims Attila piled saddles into a pyre, intending self-immolation rather than capture. Whether factual or literary embellishment, it reflects the perception of how precarious his position had become. Fighting continued into twilight. But darkness ended the slaughter. Casualties and reality. Ancient sources describe catastrophic losses. Jordanes famously cites figures upward of 165,000 dead. Modern scholarship rejects such numbers as rhetorical inflation, typical of late antique historiography. Logistically and demographically, more plausible estimates suggest perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 casualties per side, though certainty is impossible. Even at the lower end, the scale was immense by 5th century standards. The field was littered with fallen nobles, war leaders, and veterans of decades of conflict. The death of Theodoric reshaped Visigothic politics. The check inflicted upon Attila reshaped European history. The ridge had been held. The center had not broken. The scourge of God had withdrawn behind wooden walls. But the war was not yet finished. Dawn would reveal whether this was annihilation or survival. The aftermath was about to thunder across the Chit, west. Part 5. Aftermath. Attila's Italian rampage and Hunnic fall. The field at Catalaunian did not end Attila. It stopped him. But a wounded predator is still lethal. Retreat, not ruin. After withdrawing from the wagon lager, Attila led his battered coalition eastward. The campaign in Gaul had failed to secure decisive dominance, yet his power base beyond the Rhine and Danube remained intact. Within months, he resumed pressure on the Eastern Empire's Balkan provinces, leveraging devastation as negotiation. He also renewed his demand for Honoria, sister of Valentinian III, claiming her as his promised bride, and with her, half the Western Empire as dowry. The proposal was political theater, but it provided justification for renewed invasion. In 452, Attila struck again, this time into Italy itself. The Italian campaign northern Italy bore the fury. Aquileia, a fortified and strategically critical city at the head of the Adriatic, resisted fiercely. When it fell after siege operations, it was systematically destroyed. Later Venetian tradition would link refugee flight from the region to the early lagoon settlements that eventually formed Venice, though the connection, while plausible, is more gradual and complex than legend suggests. Milan and other cities suffered occupation and plunder. The psychological impact was immense. The Hunnic king stood in the heartland of Roman civilization. Yet Italy was not Gaul. The peninsula's supply network was strained. Famine and disease, possibly plague, began to ravage Attila's forces. Meanwhile, Flavius Aetius avoided pitched battle, instead applying pressure through strategic harassment and denial of resources. A diplomatic mission led by Pope Leo I met Attila near the Mincio River. Later Christian tradition cast this meeting as miraculous intervention. In reality, it likely coincided with logistical collapse. Eastern Turn, Roman pressure on Attila's Danubian rear, and mounting attrition within the Hunnic ranks. Attila withdrew. For the second time in 2 years, his advance into the Roman world stalled. Sudden death. In 453, at the height of his power but amid growing strain, Attila died. The circumstances remain debated. The most widely accepted account, preserved by the historian Priscus and later echoed by Jordanes, states that he suffered a severe hemorrhage, likely a ruptured blood vessel, on his wedding night to a new bride, Ildico. Whether natural causes or conspiracy, the effect was immediate. The Hunnic Empire had been a personal dominion, held together by Attila's authority, fear, and charisma. Without him, cohesion dissolved. The collapse at Nedao. By 454, subject peoples rebelled. At the Battle of Nedao, the sons of Attila, Elak, Dengizic, and Ernak, faced a coalition of former vassals led by the Gepid, King Ardaric. The Hunnic forces were decisively defeated. Elak was killed. The Hunnic imperial structure shattered. Within a generation, the Huns ceased to exist as a dominant European power. Remnants dispersed into steppe populations or were absorbed by successor kingdoms. Rome's fatal irony. The victory over Attila did not save the Western Empire. In 454, Valentinian III personally assassinated Aetius, fearing his general's power. According to later chroniclers, a court official warned the emperor that in killing Aetius, he had cut off his right hand with his left. The following year, Valentinian himself was murdered by men loyal to Aetius. In 455, Rome was sacked again, this time by the Vandals. The coalition that had stood at Catalaunian dissolved. The Visigoths consolidated their kingdom in Aquitaine and later expanded into Hispania. The Franks began their ascent in northern Gaul. Burgundians entrenched along the Rhone. Rome had halted the Huns, but it could not halt fragmentation. The shift of Europe. The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains did not preserve Roman supremacy. It prevented Hunnic domination. That distinction matters. By checking Attila in 451 and surviving the Italian campaign of 452, the Roman-Germanic coalition ensured that Western Europe's transformation would unfold through successor kingdoms, Visigothic, Frankish, Burgundian, rather than through a steppe empire imposed from the Danube. The Hunnic wave broke. and in its wake, medieval Europe began to take shape. The thunder faded, but the shock reshaped a continent forever. Conclusion: empires rarely fall in a single moment. They erode, fracture, bleed. And yet, sometimes, on a single field, history pauses, holds its breath, and waits to see who stands when the dust settles. In 451 AD, on the Catalaunian Plains, the Western Roman Empire, aged, weakened, politically hollowed, did something extraordinary. It did not fight alone. It could not. Instead, under Flavius Aetius, it forged a coalition from former enemies: Visigoths, Alans, Franks, Burgundians, a patchwork army, a desperate alliance, the last field force capable of meeting Attila in open battle. The clash was not myth. It was strategy. A ridge seized and contested, an Alanic center that bent but did not break, a Visigothic king, Theodoric I, falling in the melee, a Hunnic warlord withdrawing behind a ring of wagons as night consumed the dead. The result was not annihilation. It was prevention. Attila did not conquer Gaul. He did not shatter the Western coalition. His invasion of Italy the following year faltered. Within 2 years, he was dead. Within 3, the Hunnic Confederation imploded at Nidau. The steppe superpower that had terrorized 2 empires vanished almost as quickly as it had risen. And Rome. Rome survived the storm, but not itself. Aetius was murdered by his own emperor Valentinian. 3 followed him to the grave. The Western Empire would fall in 476, only 25 years after Catalaunian. But here is the truth that matters. The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains did not save Rome. It saved Europe from a different destiny. Without that coalition stand, the political map of the West might have been written by steppe warlords instead of emerging Germanic kingdoms. The Visigoths, Franks, and Burgundians, who later shaped medieval Europe, were not erased beneath a Hunnic imperium. On that field, the future pivoted. This was Rome's twilight triumph, its last great demonstration of operational brilliance, diplomatic maneuvering, and battlefield resilience. A dying empire, still capable of defiance. A general who understood both Roman discipline and Hunnic ferocity. A coalition that held when history demanded it. The thunder of hooves faded, the ridge fell silent, the scourge of God rode back east, and in the long echo of that day, the medieval world began to rise. History remembers the fall of Rome, but never forget. On one blood-soaked plain in Gaul, Rome refused to fall.